Hi guys, how do we understand China? Is China communist or capitalist? Is China going to overtake the world, or is it going to collapse in 30 days? And what do Chinese people think? What is it really like in China? How can we understand China? There's a huge problem right now because most of the world does not understand China. You can see it from the news headlines and stories around the world that there's a huge lack of understanding of China, and many Western governments admit this, that they don't have enough experts about China. And this has especially become more important because in the last 3 years the border has been closed, so students and people haven't been able to come to China. So I think that because of this, it's really important that people who do understand China or do know things about China share what they know. I'm going to share my story. I'm going to share 4 things, observations that I have about China, and 2 challenges that foreigners have about understanding China. So China is full of contradictions. It is constantly changing, and every country has good and bad things. And it's amazing that with China, like with any subject, the more that you understand about it, the more that you realize that you don't understand, because knowledge you just need to, there's so much that you don't know. So I'm just going to share my story first. I was studying politics, philosophy, economics in UK at university, and I found that every subject, China was the most interesting part in politics, philosophy, economics, and I was kind of frustrated about learning what's happening in China in books. I wanted to go to China to experience what it's really like. And I learned Chinese, and I started a company. I studied at Peking University, started a company called China Admissions, which helps international students study in China. Had an amazing experience in China, and I've learned Chinese, and I've seen China change so fast in the last 10, 12 years that I've been here. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that before I came to China, I had so many misconceptions about what China was like. I didn't have any idea what Chinese people were like, and I absolutely had no idea. And then when I came here, I realized that they're basically the same as us. They have many different types of people, and they have funny people, interesting, crazy people, extremely smart people. So I just understood how rich the culture was, how rich and diverse the people are in China in some way. So I'm going to share 4 observations that I have about China and some challenges that foreigners have in understanding China. The biggest thing that everyone says about China is that it's collectivist and the West is individualist, and this is like what everyone says, but this is not just about China. This is an Asian thing in Japan, Korea, many other places in Asia. And it's also top-down versus bottom-up, which is just how it's been for a very long time in China. And this is the biggest difference, and the biggest difference between the West and China is being individual versus collective. And one of the ways and reasons that people don't understand China, that people in China focus much more on social responsibility rather than freedom, and in China harmony is extremely important. So this is a cultural difference that they have in China. So the second thing that I'd like to share is about the history of China's culture and about farming. So you could say that culture comes from this, or you could say that this leads to the culture. It's hard to know, maybe a bit of both. But in China, they used to have, or they have, rice farming, which is very different to farming in the West. And so there's 2 people who talk about this. One of them is Malcolm Gladwell, and one of them is Yuan Tengfei, who talk about how the farming culture has influenced China. One of the ways is that because rice farming is extremely intensive and it requires people in China to just work many hours and make sure that the conditions are perfectly right for rice farming. So it means that the culture has to be much more collective so that people work together, and it also means that there's less time to have breaks because you need to be constantly farming and constantly working. So that may have influenced the culture in China compared to in the West, where we had a different kind of farming, such as wheat farming. And Yuan Tengfei mentions how he thinks that this has a big impact on the culture, because in China you have to learn farming from your parents and how to do farming, which is important, and also how in Europe there wasn't enough farming, so there wasn't enough food available in many places, so that they had to do trading to get the rest of the goods. So that's why in Europe it became much more of a trading culture, whereas China became more of a farming culture. And this is also a reason why in China they're less likely to want to explore to other countries, because it's necessary to stay on the same stay in the farm to farm, because there's less time available to travel and explore and trade. So that this is a difference that many people say has influenced Chinese culture, or is an example of it. Another thing is language in China versus the West. This is a huge difference, the Chinese language, and it's such an interesting and amazing language because it's so rich. It has so many interesting characters that are so complicated. And one of the things that is interesting to share is that to think about is that in the history, for most of the time, like everywhere in the world, it was only a small number of people could actually use the language, and most people were illiterate. And so this could have contributed more to the top-down culture, or it could have been caused by the top-down culture making the language challenging. But one of the things is that the Chinese language is a written language, primarily a written language that is spoken, and English is a spoken language that is written. So that means that when you're looking at words in English, it's basically written down by how it sounds. But in China, the characters is you speak what you've written. So you might have a character in many different parts of China, but people will say it in a different way based on the character. So the characters is much more about how does it look, and it has a lot of hidden meaning inside each of the characters, which is important to think about how that could have impacted the culture. Anyway, the idea is that I think it's really important to understand China is to understand the writing, because it impacts the culture so deeply in so many ways, and understand the language is a really important way to understand the culture. And the other thing that is important to think about in China is that in China they think of it as more of a civilization, but in the West we think of more as a nation. And so if you look at, actually in 1648 we had the Westphalian system, which is when there were lots of wars happening in Europe, and then basically there was a peace in 1648 where everyone decided that you can have countries and we will respect your country and we're a country and this is the system. But China just thinks more as a civilization, and the culture is much more about a civilization and the Chinese people. So it's important to think about that there is this difference. China was not in 1648 in Europe, and this is where there are different ways of seeing the world based on that. And yeah, so if you're interested to learn more about China and Chinese culture, I recommend check out Confucius, books about Confucius and Lao Tzu, which is really good. There's a great book by Dyer about that, about Tao Te Ching, and I really recommend that to understand Chinese culture. And then also, what's his name? I forget. I'll share the link of some other books in the comments. So there's some other observations I want to share about China and Chinese culture. One of them is that when we are looking at China, we're always thinking about it from our perspective, because we have a lens as foreigners. We have our own society and our own culture. That whenever we look at another culture, we think about it from our perspective. But it's like we have our own culture. It's like a goldfish in a bowl of water. You don't realize that you have this culture and these perspectives until you take a goldfish out of water. Then the goldfish can see the water for what it is. And I think it's also the same as people who are looking at China from our own culture. We are not seeing it clearly because we are seeing it through our own culture. So it's really important to try and think about it not from our culture, and just be aware that we have our own perspectives and our own history that influences how we think about things. And then also, this is actually also an advantage when we're looking at trying to understand China, because we are seeing it from outside and we are looking at China from an outside perspective. So it means that we can see things from a different way. And so there's an example of this is Richard Sears, who is an expert on Chinese language and understands the characters, where all the characters come from. And he looks at this character came from this, and the evolution of each character and how it changed over time. And he is basically says that he is amazed that Chinese people do not see this, because they have grown up with this and they learn Chinese characters from rote, and they are not as able to understand it as he is, because as a foreigner he is able to see the steps that Chinese language has changed. So this is really interesting that foreigners actually may have an advantage in looking at Chinese culture from another perspective. And then also we can say that there's also like a bias that we have, because we are looking at China from our perspective right now, but actually I think that many people have an idea that actually we are really advanced in a really advanced period of time and a really advanced era, but actually just because we're in 2022 doesn't mean we are so superior, so advanced. Just like if you look back in 1922, people at that time would have thought, oh, we are extremely advanced and superior, but people in 21, 22, in 100 years time are going to look back on us and think of us as being extremely primitive or not very, we had many problems. You can just see how many issues we have that 50 years ago would not be acceptable. that 50 years ago things that were acceptable that are not anymore. So I think this is also important to think about it, that actually maybe we're not as superior as we think, and just try and think about it like that. So anyway, these are some observations that I have about China, and my message is, first, we need to try and understand China and have an open mind about it, and also it's important that people who do understand China do share and talk about it, so we can try and increase understanding about China. And I hope that was helpful. If you have any comments, let me know in the comments. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.